It did not feel like a realization. That is the first thing to say honestly, because realization implies a moment of clarity arriving cleanly, with the specific quality of something understood all at once. What actually happened was more gradual and less legible than that, more like a slow, accumulating pressure that did not announce itself as grief or recognition or the beginning of anything significant, until it had already been building long enough that ignoring it required more active effort than simply letting it be what it was. What it was, eventually, was the understanding that you were gone. Not gone in the sense of physically absent. The avoidant has always been comfortable with physical absence, has constructed an entire relational architecture around making physical absence the default. Gone in the different, more specific, more consequential sense of genuinely no longer oriented toward them, no longer reaching, no longer carrying in the background of your daily life the specific and persistent orientation toward them that had been present throughout the dynamic, even in its most painful phases. That specific goneness is what produced the moment, and the moment, when it finally arrived with enough force to be undeniable, was not what either party would have predicted. The avoidant would describe it this way: if they had the language and the willingness to be fully honest about an interior experience they have spent significant effort not fully inhabiting. There was a day, ordinary in its externals, unremarkable in every visible feature, when something in the ambient quality of the interior shifted. Not dramatically, not with the force of an event, with the specific, quiet, impossible to precisely locate quality of something becoming absent that had been present so consistently that its presence had long since stopped being noticed as presence and had simply become the background condition of ordinary experience. You had been, throughout the entire duration of the dynamic and through the silence that followed it, a background condition of their ordinary experience. Not always consciously, not always in the form of explicit thought or named feeling, but present, the way ambient temperature is present, shaping the interior climate without the interior explicitly registering the source of the shaping. There was something in the relational field that carried your orientation toward them, your attention, your continued existence as someone who cared about their interior. And the management system, occupied as it was with the business of maintaining the self-sufficient exterior and suppressing the attachment needs that your presence was consistently activating, never fully registered what the background warmth was doing, until the day it was not there. The not-there-ness was the moment, not the leaving. The leaving had happened earlier, in the various forms that genuine departure takes. The not-there-ness was the interior registering, with the specific, delayed, now undeniable quality of something that has been suppressed past the capacity of the suppression to continue, that the background condition was genuinely absent. Not temporarily, not in the strategic way of someone who withdraws to be pursued, in the real way. The way that means the relational field had reorganized itself around a different center, and that center was not them. The avoidant would describe what this felt like in the interior, if they allowed themselves to describe it honestly, as something in the register of sudden exposure. Not exposure in the external social sense, exposure in the interior sense of being in a space that had previously been insulated by something they had not acknowledged as insulation, and finding, in that insulation's absence, the full unmediated weight of the space itself. The space itself was the interior. The same interior they had always inhabited alone. The same self-regulation strategies, the same management tools, the same self-sufficient architecture that had always been sufficient. Except that it was not, in this moment, quite as sufficient as it had been. Except that something the interior was accustomed to having in the background, some quality of not being entirely alone in the interior, that your orientation toward them had been providing, without either party naming it as something being provided, was simply not there. This is the piece that the avoidant finds most difficult to articulate and most significant when they are being fully honest about the moment of realization. It is not that they missed you in the obvious, feelings on the surface, explicitly aware way. It is that the interior revealed itself, in your genuine absence, to have been less entirely alone than it had been performing. To have been borrowing, from the fact of your continued orientation toward them, something that it had incorporated into its ordinary functioning without registering as borrowed. The self-sufficiency was genuine, is genuine, but it was operating with a structural support it had not acknowledged as support. The ambient warmth of being genuinely oriented toward by someone who saw the real version, who knew the defended interior and was still, against all the architecture's efforts to make it unreachable, reaching toward it with genuine care. That warmth had been present, had been absorbed, had become, silently and without acknowledgement, a feature of the interior landscape that the self-regulation strategies were operating within. Without it, the landscape was the same landscape, but its quality was different in a specific and initially difficult to locate way. A way that the avoidant spent some time attributing to other things, to the season, to work, to the ordinary fluctuation of a person's interior that does not require explanation beyond the generic acknowledgement that some periods are simply harder. Until the attributing ran out of convincing targets, and what was left was the honest, unmediated recognition of what was actually different. You were gone. Not your physical presence, that had been gone through various phases of the dynamic. The specific, irreplaceable, nothing else approximates it quality of your genuine orientation toward them, your seeing of them, your continued warmth directed at the interior they worked so hard to keep unreachable. That was gone. And the interior, running its ordinary processes without that background warmth for long enough that the absence could no longer be attributed to anything else, arrived at the understanding that the gone was real. The realization of real goneness produces something in the avoidant that is different from the ordinary management of loss. It produces a specific, interior, largely behavioral kind of review. Not the deliberate, intentional, I am now examining what happened kind of review. The involuntary kind. The kind where specific moments from the dynamic surface with unusual clarity and unusual emotional weight. Not as a sequence of events being analyzed, but as a felt re-encounter with the specific quality of what those moments contained. The moment when you said something that demonstrated you understood something about them they had not said directly. The moment when you responded to the defended interior with warmth instead of the withdrawal they had been bracing for. The moment when what you offered was so precisely the thing the interior was reaching for that the system activated immediately, not because it was unwanted, but because it was wanted in a way the system was not prepared to manage. These moments surface with their original feeling intact, not mediated by the story the avoidant built afterward about incompatibility or timing or mutual complexity, with the actual unmediated feeling of what the moments contained. And the feeling, encountered directly in the interior where it actually lives beneath the management, is not the threatening activation the system was managing away from. It is something quieter and more honest than threat. It is something in the register of having been home, briefly, in a way that the architecture of self-sufficiency does not ordinarily produce, and having lost the home before understanding that it was home. That recognition, having lost the home before understanding it as home, is the center of the moment, the specific, irreducible, honest core of what the avoidant is reckoning with when the realization arrives in its full dimensions. Not simply that you are gone, that the goneness is the loss of something that the rejection, at the time of the rejection, did not fully understand itself to be rejecting. The rejection was the system doing what systems do, protecting the architecture by pushing away the thing that was pressing on it with more force and more precision than the architecture was designed to accommodate. The system was not wrong about what the pressing was doing. The pressing was genuinely threatening to the architecture. Your perception, your warmth directed at the real interior, your continued orientation toward what was actually there, all of it was doing what the system correctly identified as dangerous. It was making the defended interior accessible in ways the architecture exists to prevent. What the system did not calculate, because systems do not calculate what they were not built to account for, was the cost of the inaccessibility. The ongoing, accumulating, now fully arrived cost of an interior that kept the threatening thing out, and lost, in keeping it out, the only relational context in which the interior was being genuinely known. That cost is what the moment of realization is the full arrival of. The calculation the system could not make at the time of the rejection, made now, in the specific and unmediated terms of genuine absence. The avoidant who arrives at this moment is at a threshold. This has been said throughout various pieces in this series, and it is worth saying again with full honesty about what the threshold actually is and what it is not. The threshold is not the guaranteed beginning of change. The moment of realization does not automatically generate the willingness and the capacity and the sustained effort that genuine change requires. It generates the conditions in which change is possible. The interior has been honest with itself about the cost. The calculation has been made. The genuine recognition of what was lost and what the losing cost has arrived, and has been, in the specific and difficult and involuntary way of something that could not continue to be suppressed, past the pressure that genuine absence created, felt. What the avoidant does at the threshold is the open question. The question that belongs entirely to them, on their timeline, in their process, with whatever resources, internal and external, they bring to it. Some arrive at the threshold and find, in the conditions it creates, the beginning of genuine engagement with the interior work that the realization is pointing toward. Find, in the full arrival of the cost, the motivation that the avoidance psychology requires to move toward vulnerability rather than away from it. Begin, imperfectly and with significant resistance and no guarantee of where it leads, the work of examining why the architecture was built and whether it is still serving the life it was built to protect. Others arrive at the threshold and, after a period of genuine encounter with the cost, begin the work of rebuilding the management to accommodate the new information, of constructing a story around the realization that contains it rather than opening it, of moving forward in the self-sufficient way that the architecture always produces, carrying the realization in the interior as one of the things the interior holds without acting on, in the way the interior has always held what it does not act on. Both happen, both are real. And which one happens is not determined by the depth of the realization or the accuracy of the cost calculation, or the genuine, specific, fully arrived understanding of what was lost. It is determined by the willingness. The empath does not need to monitor for which one happens. This is the honest, direct, genuinely useful thing to say at the end of a piece that has been, by design, closer to the avoidance interior than most of this series. The empath has been given, through this examination, the most accurate available account of what the moment of realization actually looks like and feels like and produces in the avoidance interior. What she does with that account is not oriented it toward him, not used to calibrate the availability she maintains at the edge of his potential readiness, not allowed to become the new form of the old orientation, the monitoring of whether the realization produced the threshold and whether the threshold is producing the change. She has her life, being lived, genuinely and with increasing fullness and decreasing reference to what is or is not happening on the other side of the silence she created. The avoidant realized they lost her in the specific, involuntary, cost-arrived moment that genuine absence eventually produces. She realized she had found herself in the same silence. Both realizations are real. Only one of them is hers to keep building from. And she is building, every day. Without waiting for the report from the other side of the silence, without requiring confirmation that the realization occurred, without needing anything from the moment he understood what he lost, to know, fully and without remainder, what she found. Herself, still here, still extraordinary, still entirely, irrevocably, worth every bit of what it took to arrive at this, her own life, fully inhabited, finally hers. She is building. That is where the last piece ended, and where this one begins. Because the building is not a metaphor that resolves at the end of a sentence. It is the actual, daily, ongoing work of a person who has been through something significant and is living forward from it. And living forward, in the honest rather than the idealized version, contains more than the clarity and the self-possession and the hard-won discernment that the arc has been tracing. It contains the ordinary difficulty of days that do not feel like progress, the unexpected surfacing of feeling at moments that do not seem to warrant it, the complicated texture of genuinely moving on from something that was genuinely real. This is worth saying directly because the narrative of healing, when it moves consistently toward resolution, can create a standard that the actual lived experience of healing does not meet, can make the ordinary fluctuation of the process feel like failure, can make a difficult day, a day when something surfaces that the previous week seems settled, feel like the loss of ground that was hard to gain. The standard is false. The ground is not lost in a difficult day. The process is not linear, and the nonlinearity is not evidence of insufficient progress. It is evidence of being human, of having had something real and processing it the way real things require to be processed, slowly, incompletely, with returns and revisitations that are part of the integration rather than obstacles to it. The avoidant, in the moment of realization that the previous piece traced, is also not experiencing a linear process. The moment arrives, as has been described, with a specific and undeniable quality of genuine reckoning. And then, because this is how interior experience actually works rather than how we might prefer it to work, the moment passes. The management system, which is sophisticated and which has been performing its function for decades, begins the work of processing what the moment produced, not necessarily suppressing it back entirely, but metabolizing it, converting it from the acute, full arrival quality of the genuine reckoning into something more manageable, something that can be held in the interior without requiring the specific, sustained, "this is what I am going to do about it" engagement that the moment, at its peak, seemed to demand. This is not cynicism about the avoidance capacity for genuine change. It is accuracy about how psychological change actually moves in people whose defensive structures are deeply established. The moment of realization is real. Its full, acute, nothing managed about it quality is real. And the subsequent processing, the gradual, largely unconscious work of the management system integrating the new information without being dismantled by it, is also real. And the integration does not always produce the change that the moment seemed to make necessary. Sometimes it produces something more like the acknowledgement that has been filed, the reckoning that has been recorded, the honest accounting of what was lost that now lives in the interior alongside everything else the interior holds, without necessarily generating the behavioral response that the accounting would seem to warrant. This is the avoidant's specific relationship with their own interior knowledge. They can know things, genuinely, clearly, with the full weight of honest reckoning, and still not act on the knowing in the ways that the knowing might seem to require. The gap between knowing and acting is not unique to the avoidant, but it is, in the avoidant, one of the widest and most structurally maintained gaps available in the full range of human psychological experience. The empath has lived inside this gap, has felt the full, specific cost of being someone who is oriented toward the interior knowledge while being in relationship with someone whose relationship to their own interior knowledge does not reliably produce behavioral expression of it. The gap was the central, defining, most costly feature of the dynamic. The understanding that what was present in the interior was real, genuine, significant, and the understanding, arrived at slowly and at significant cost, that interior reality and behavioral expression are separate things that do not automatically converge. What she carries from having lived inside the gap is, among other things, a very clear and very embodied understanding of her own relationship to this same distinction. Because she is not immune to the gap herself, she has her own ways, less structurally established, less architecturally defended, but present nonetheless, in which the knowing and the acting do not always converge, in which what she understands clearly does not always translate immediately into what she does. Her version of the gap tends to show up not in the suppression of genuine feeling, but in the opposite direction, in the continuation of investment past the point where the honest assessment would have redirected it, in the maintenance of hope past the point where the evidence had given hope adequate reason to continue, in the bringing of her full, extraordinary, nothing held back self to connections before the behavioral evidence had sufficiently confirmed that the connection was equipped to receive what she was bringing. That is her version of the gap. Not between feeling and expression. The empath's feeling and expression are in considerably better alignment than the avoidance. Between accurate perception and the behavioral choices that follow from it. Between seeing clearly and acting on what she sees at the pace the seeing warrants, rather than the pace that the longing and the hope and the genuine care for the person she is perceiving recommend. The work that the arc of this entire examination has been tracing, for her, is the narrowing of her version of the gap, not the elimination of it. The gap between perception and action exists in everyone, and is not a flaw to be eliminated, but a human condition to be navigated with as much honesty and self-compassion as possible. but the narrowing of it. The reduction of the distance between what she sees and what she does with what she sees. The gradual, experience-based, now available in real-time ability to act on accurate perception without waiting for the accumulation of painful evidence to make the action feel unavoidable. This narrowing is one of the most practically significant things that the experience of the avoidant dynamic produces in the empath, who processes it honestly rather than simply surviving it. Because the dynamic, as painful as it was, provided an unusually clear and unusually extended education in the specific experience of seeing accurately and not acting on what was seen, of perceiving the gap between the avoidant's interior and exterior clearly, and continuing to invest in the interior as if the exterior's failure to express it were a temporary condition rather than a structural feature of the situation. The education and what that costs, felt in the body, lived through the full duration of the dynamic, arrived at with the specific, embodied, not theoretical knowledge of someone who paid the full price of it, is the material from which the narrowing is made. She knows, now, what it costs to see clearly and not act on what is seen, not as a concept, as a lived, irreversible, changes how she moves forward understanding. Moving forward with that understanding looks specific in practice. It looks like the ability to perceive depth in someone, genuine depth, real interior complexity, the actual human richness beneath the managed surface, without immediately and fully investing in that depth, as if the investment were warranted by the perception alone. Without the automatic, almost reflexive bringing of everything she is to the interior she perceives, before the exterior has demonstrated that the interior will find adequate expression in the behavioral world. It looks like the ability to hold interest and care and even genuine warmth in the early stages of a connection, while also maintaining the clear, honest, consistently updated reading of what the behavioral evidence is showing. Not the held at distance, nothing offered until everything is confirmed stance of someone who has converted the avoidant experience into a reason for defensive closure, but the open and discerning stance of someone who is genuinely available to what is actually being offered, while remaining clear about the distinction between what is offered and what is perceived to exist in the interior. The distinction, held consciously and acted on rather than overridden by the compelling quality of what she perceives, changes the trajectory of how connections develop from the beginning. Rather than being fully in and discovering later that the behavioral reality is insufficient, she moves toward with genuine openness while reading the behavioral trend. Allowing the depth of her investment to be calibrated by the convergence of what she perceives and what is being demonstrated, rather than by the depth of what she perceives alone. This is not a formula. It is not a set of rules that can be applied mechanically to produce different outcomes without the genuine interior work that makes the application honest rather than performed. The work is the foundation, the understanding of what she perceives and what the perception requires of her in terms of honest action. The self-trust that allows her to act on what she sees rather than hoping past it. The specific, non-negotiable, embodied knowledge of what she requires in a connection for the full, extraordinary quality of her presence to be genuinely received rather than consumed. All of that is the foundation. The specific, practical navigation of new connections is built on top of it. And the foundation, which the arc of this entire examination has been tracing, from its painful beginning through its hard-won and ongoing present, is more solid than it has ever been. The avoidant, meanwhile, is somewhere in the process that the moment of realization initiated, in the management of the moment or the genuine engagement with what the moment opened, on the threshold or past it or still approaching it, in the interior work or in the reconstruction of the management system around the new information. All of those positions are possible. All of them are real trajectories that the moment of realization can produce, and none of them are the empaths to monitor, to hope about, to remain partially available for in the possibility that the right position is the one being occupied. She has her life, genuinely, concretely, specifically hers. The friendships that are receiving her full attention. The creative and professional and intellectual engagements that have the full bandwidth of a person who is no longer disproportionately occupied with the management of someone else's unavailability. The physical existence of a person who is present in her own body and her own daily experience in a way that the chronic, low-level preoccupation of the dynamic was consistently, slightly preventing. And the future connections, the ones that are coming, on the ordinary timeline of a life being genuinely lived, in the normal course of a person who is full and present and not organized around waiting, those connections will find her in a different position than the one in which the avoidant found her. Not a harder position, not a more defended position, a more honest one, more precisely herself, more conscious of what she perceives and what it requires of her, more capable of the simultaneous holding of genuine openness and clear-eyed discernment that allows connection to develop at the pace the evidence warrants, rather than the pace that the perception alone recommends. The avoidant realized they lost her at the moment when the genuine absence of her orientation toward them became undeniable. When the background warmth of her seeing them was genuinely gone, and the interior, running its ordinary processes in the full and unmitigated absence of that warmth, arrived at the honest accounting of what the warmth had been doing and what its absence cost. She found herself in the same silence, in the same space that the absence created. But what she found was not the accounting of loss. It was the reclamation of something that the dynamic had been gradually, quietly, significantly occupying. Her own interior, her own attention, her own extraordinary, fully functional, nothing diminished by the experience perceptual and emotional capacity, now available to the full range of her own life, rather than disproportionately directed at the interior of someone who was working so hard to keep it out. That reclamation is ongoing. It is not complete in the clean sense of something finished. It continues, in the ordinary, daily, unremarkable way of a person who is simply living her life and finding, in the living of it, that the life is more than adequate to the full quality of her presence. More than adequate, worth the full presence, worth everything she brings. The avoidant knew this, eventually, in the moment of realization, in the honest interior accounting of what was lost. She knows it now, not eventually, not after the loss forced the accounting, now, in the middle of the building, in the middle of the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life that is hers, without waiting for any moment on any other timeline to confirm what she already knows, what she has always known, what the dynamic spent significant effort trying to make her doubt, and failed. Because what she is, what she has always been, is not the kind of thing that can be permanently argued out of its own knowing by someone else's inability to receive it. She knows. She has always known. She is simply finally living from that knowing, without apology, without remainder, without anyone's confirmation required. Complete.